Welcome back to One Piece Explained. The end of the series has been played out in front of us more or less, as chapter 1138 reveals both the history and future of this world. Of course, not everything is as straightforward as we'd like, so there's a bunch to talk about between that gorgeous mural at the end of the chapter, the various implications of Shanks, Shamrock, and their swords, the potential confirmation of who that silhouetted man walking around Elbaf actually is, and much more. I usually don't do this, but since this one is a long one, if you're here specifically for a breakdown of the mural and the Harley texts, feel free to skip ahead to the final section. Otherwise, let's get into it. In the 24th entry in the Ogre Child Yamato's Golden Harvest Surrogate Pilgrimage cover story, we get the not-so-shocking reveal that the mysterious base with the giant structure of Who's Who's head is under the command of none other than Who's Who himself. Surrounding him is the group, which according to the V-Ray cards was known as Cats, comprised of members of the Who's Who pirates who joined their captain under Kaido. We saw the bulk of this group toward the start of the raid on Onigashima, with the two women and larger man in cat masks, sort of resembling Who's Who's, and we'd see the rest of the group later on when they encountered Jinbei, including the pipe-smoking cheetah or leopard mink, as well as the lion smile fruit user. The various other members of the crew are missing from this cover page, but I imagine they are all around somewhere as well. Now, you'll notice that the interior of this hideout largely resembles the Big Cat Cafe where Who's Who's group resided in Onigashima, from the architecture to the decorations and even the framed kanji reading cat. Much like the henchmen we saw in the previous chapter, the group here has taken on Wano-style clothing with various kimonos and sandals, though Who's Who is still sporting his belt from his original outfit over top. I had wondered what the symbol on the buckles of the men in the previous cover story entry could have been, and now I'm wondering if it's supposed to be the same design. Of course, in the foreground are two women serving drinks and playing music. These could be the abducted soba shop workers that Some was telling Yamato about, and after seeing the base in the previous chapters, we had suspected Who's Who may be behind these kidnappings, but it seems someone in his group was also responsible for the theft of Yasue's sword. I had spoken about how this was unlikely to be Hold'em, since he was shown attacking Yamato's group afterwards and did not have the blade on him, and with him being taken captive by Yamato just before they came to the hideout, it would mean someone else had to have been responsible. Recall Who's Who was depicted with a sword upon its introduction, but we eventually came to find out that it was merely a dagger with a long sheath. This weapon was largely abandoned after he transitioned into his hybrid form against Jinbei, so perhaps Who's Who is on the market for a new blade. Despite all of this, it doesn't feel like Who's Who is meant to be the main conflict in this arc, but rather just the initial setup for a bigger twist down the line. Maybe this will be the means for Yamato to recruit more of Kaido's former men under his own banner, so I'm excited to see where we go from here. That said, let's get into chapter 1138, the Harley. With Loki having declined Shamrock and Gunko's invitation into the Holy Knights, the pair prepares for their next course of action when Loki asks what everyone is thinking, just what exactly is going on between Shamrock and Shanks. Well, as it turns out, the two are indeed brothers, twins in fact, with Shamrock being slightly older. While it was probably easy for Loki to realize that it wouldn't make much sense for Shanks to return after having already been here just to recruit him for some world government military unit, this observation of the two brothers' identical faces by Loki does give us some hard confirmation that he can indeed see through his bandages, though it's not entirely clear just how. When he was first introduced, he was briefly portrayed as having some sort of glow coming from his eyes underneath the wraps. Some wondered if this was a devil fruit ability, though we quickly learned that he was covered in copious amounts of sea stone. Others speculated that this could be some form of observation haki, which could be what is allowing him to distinguish Shamrock's facial features. When we first saw the point of view of an observation haki user in Dressrosa, it was mostly limited to vague blobs and silhouettes, as we saw with Usopp and Fujitora. However, when we saw the applications of more advanced forms of observation, such as with Luffy during Whole Cake Island, some more detail was present, especially in the enemy's face. We actually wondered if he was using Future Sight in the last chapter to perceive Gunko's incoming attacks, so perhaps Loki just has access to some truly insane observation haki. This may have been initially hinted at when we were told how he was able to see through the swapping of Lola for Chiffon, which funny enough was the first pair of twins that he had to deal with. Now Shamrock explains that Shanks did not end up following the same path as he did, and at one point in time, Shanks apparently returned to Mary Joie, but decided to leave. There are a lot of potential implications here, so let's quickly refresh ourselves on Shanks' known history so we can best ascertain just when exactly he would have gone back. Our first known detail about Shanks' life is that 38 years ago, at the age of 1, he was found by the Roger pirates in a treasure chest taken from God Valley. This detail has not yet been revealed in the manga proper, but was divulged to us in some of the canonical material surrounding Film Red, with Volume 4 Billion and some sketches drawn by Oda. This scene was briefly adapted in the actual film itself, with Shanks' perspective as Roger, Rayleigh, and Gaban all gaze down upon him. The Roger Pirates took Shanks in and raised him as one of their own, and this was actually hinted at during Oden's flashback in the Wano arc, with Roger and Rayleigh reminiscing about having a baby on the ship when Oden's family came aboard. He was presumably with the crew until 25 years ago, when he, aged 14, decided to stay behind to look over a sick Buggy, as the rest of the crew went on to Laugh Tale. When Roger returned, Shanks asked him a question and immediately wept in response. It's still unknown what the scene was about, but we'll touch back on it in just a second. That same year, the Roger Pirates disbanded, and then the year after, a 15-year-old Shanks would be seen crying once again, but this time at Roger's execution. There, he spoke briefly with Buggy, as we first saw during Shanks' meeting with Whitebeard, but more recently, we had learned that this is when Shanks declared he no longer wanted to go to Laugh Tale and instead wished to just be a pirate, much to Buggy's disappointment. 2 years later, at the age of 17, Shanks appeared before Yasopp looking to recruit him, and though the events of Film Red as a whole are not canon, according to Volume 4 Billion, the Red Hair Pirates would end up finding Uta 3 years later. 13 years ago, at the age of 26, Shanks and his crew would end up stealing the Gum Gum fruit from Cypherpole, with him having received his scar from Blackbeard by this point, and this was the same year that Shanks would end up settling in the East Blue for about a year or so and end up befriending Luffy. Around 12 years ago, Shanks would apparently end up leaving Uta with the former king of the Elysia Kingdom, as seen in Film Red, though this was another piece of information from Volume 4 Billion. From there, Shanks would return to the East Blue and the events of Chapter 1 would eventually take place. Soon after, Shanks would head back to the New World and stop by Shabondi, where he'd meet up with Rayleigh once again and tell him about a boy in the East Blue that reminded him of Roger. 6 years later, at the age of 33, Shanks would defeat Loki and take him back to Elbaf, the same year that he ended up becoming an Emperor of the Sea. And at some point in time between 3 years later after that and before the start of Luffy's journey, Ace would visit Shanks to thank him for saving Luffy as a child. This brings us to the start of the series a few years later, so I won't get into the nitty-gritty of that, but from this, we can see a few potential instances where he may have returned to Mary Joie. While he was with Roger's crew for the most of his early life, the first opportunity to visit the Holy Land would have been when he chose not to go to Laugh Tale with the rest of the crew. While he mentioned he was going to look after Buggy, it's plausible that he took some time on his own, perhaps having realized the nature of his origin, or perhaps this was actually when he first became aware of that as a possibility and wept upon receiving confirmation from Roger. The next opportunity would be, of course, after the Roger Pirates disbanded. Perhaps Shanks' disillusionment with sailing to Laugh Tale was a byproduct of him grappling with his lineage, and maybe he did not consider himself worthy of such a world-changing goal because of it. But of course, there is still the chance that Shanks did not know about his circumstance until his adulthood, and that his motivation to remain a simple pirate was independent of any big revelation. In such a case, then unless he found out within the 2 years between Roger's execution and him recruiting Yasopp, it would mean that Shanks had already formed his crew when he revisited Mary Joie, which I suppose is possible. After all, we know he was at least close to the Red Line when he visited Rayleigh 12 years ago. There is another interesting option here when considering Shanks' meeting with Whitebeard. Back then, Shanks brought a gift of some alcohol supposedly from the West Blue, claiming it to be booze from his hometown. Now, hometown can mean anything ranging from just a place that you were born to a place where you spent your formative years growing up. But as we established, Shanks spent nearly every year of his life on a pirate ship, aside from the first one. This line has always been quite confusing ever since we started peeling back some of the layers of Shanks' backstory. Conveniently, God Valley, where Shanks was found by Roger, was located in the West Blue, but as we know, it no longer exists as far as we can tell. Perhaps this is a case similar to Ohara, where it is only removed from the maps and is still accessible if one tries to get there, but it has been made out to have vanished entirely, so I guess we can't really say. It is possible that Garling had Shanks somewhere in the West Blue, especially considering that the Holy Knights do not necessarily seem to be permanently settled at Mary Joie. We can garner this given the elders being surprised Shamrocks was around for the reverie, and the fact that no Holy Knights were involved when the revolutionaries attacked on the 4th day of the meeting, with Garling having only been called in after the fact. But if it is the case that Garling had Shanks in Mary Joie, I wonder if Shanks is only mentioning the West Blue as a front here, and is instead actually referring to the alcohol being from his hometown of the Holy Land. Such a case would mean he had returned at some point in his recent pirating career. While anything is possible, I imagine that it's much more likely that he returned to the Holy Land alone, rather than when he was part of a pirate crew. So to me, the most plausible times would be either when Shanks abstained from going to Laugh Tale, or after the Roger Pirates disbanded and before the Red Hair Pirates formed. However, there is another possibility, and this is that the original twist of Shanks visiting the elders during the reverie being a double twist. At this point, most of us believe that this has to actually be Shamrock, but what if it was in fact Shanks like we originally were led to believe? Seems a bit unlikely, but I figured it may be worth pointing out. Now, there may actually be another way of figuring out just when Shanks went back to Mary Schwa, but for that, we'll have to first talk about some swords. Loki is not very amused by being a punching bag for the Figarland family, and as he begins to threaten Shamrock, we get a quick view of the rest of Loki's beastly friends having been pinned down by Gunko's arrows. Last chapter we saw the centipede snake, the Delkong, and the terror bear, but now we can see the mammoth dance was also defeated, and I believe this is the wolf that we saw getting choked a few chapters ago all the way to the side. But the most interesting beast is actually on Shamrock's side, as he readies his sword in response to Loki's taunts, and with this, we get an introduction of a strange new ability as Shanks' sword, seemingly named Cerberus, turns into a Cerberus. Well, sort of. We see the 3 heads of the dog begin to form out of the sword's blade, eventually spawning the full creature, but it seems that it is still tethered to the sword itself through this dark flame-like material, actually very reminiscent of what we saw with Gunko in the previous chapter and the summoning circles that we've seen in these last 2 arcs. The joke here is that in Japanese, ken can be used to refer to a sword, but also at times can be in reference to a dog. There's a ton to talk about with this, so let's start with the most obvious explanation for what this may be: a Zoan devil fruit eaten by a sword. We've only seen this sort of thing a handful of times in the series, with our first instance being with Lasso, Mr. Four's bazooka that ate the dog fruit model Dachshund. At the time, Miss Merry Christmas had explained that the ability to feed devil fruits to inanimate objects was the latest Grand Line technology, a line that would later get expanded upon by Kobe and Helmeppo after the Enies Lobby arc, where they revealed that this was Dr. Vegapunk's recent discovery. During Enies Lobby, we had gotten Funkfried, Spandam's sword that ate the elephant fruit, and fast forward to the Punk Hazard arc, and we would meet Smiley, a condensed mass of H2 gas that was fed the Sala Sala fruit model Axolotl by Caesar Clown. And a bit more inconspicuously, we would end up getting Bunbuku, Sukiyaki's teapot that somehow ate the dog fruit model Tanuki. Many have surmised that Zoan fruits having a will of their own is what allows these objects to come to life in the first place, but to this day, despite having already met Vegapunk in the previous arc, we still do not have a clear answer on the process in which an inanimate object is fed a devil fruit. While this may be our second instance of a sword eating a devil fruit, this would be our first example of a mythical Zoan being not only imbued in an object, but having awakened as well, whatever that may mean. So let's talk about that. If this is a devil fruit, this would presumably be the mythical dog fruit model Cerberus, with the Cerberus of course being the 3-headed hound associated with Hades in Greek mythology, who guards the gates of the underworld. We actually have seen a Cerberus in the series before, although it was actually a zombie stitched together with the heads of 2 dogs and a fox. The design here is also somewhat similar to that one, with the tongues hanging out and the spiked collars. While all of the inanimate object Zoans in the series have been different enough from one another to the point of not having any strong commonalities, we can compare this to the other Zoan sword, Funkfried. As mentioned earlier, Cerberus still seems to be tethered to his original blade at what we can see in this one panel as the tail. This is starkly different from what we saw with Funkfried, who fully became an elephant itself and had no features of the sword whatsoever in Zoan form. Though I should note that this is somewhat similar to Funkfried's hybrid form, where his trunk retained the properties of the blade, with the rest of his body seemingly extending out of the sword's handle, as opposed to just connecting to the tail like here. It's also not entirely clear just how much of the sword itself is present while attached to the beast, as in some panels you can see the full length of the blade, whereas in others it's a lot shorter. The Cerberus has a rather interesting ability, as each head can extend a blade from its mouth, but not only that, each head can also seemingly detach and propel into the air. All of this is actually very reminiscent of the strange techniques that we saw throughout Onigashima with the ancient Zoans. The gyrating neck or dog collar to achieve flight is much like Sasaki's Heliceratops technique, while the ability to detach its heads is akin to Queen's Brachioснекis technique, in which he is able to somehow launch a snake-like portion of his body. All of these wacky moves were hand-waved as being how dinosaurs hunted in ancient times, so it's interesting to see more of these logic-defying feats yet extended to the other Zoans as well. That is, if this is even a Zoan in the first place. See, there is some chance that this ability is more than just a simple awakened mythical Zoan that was fed to an inanimate object, as wild of a sentence as that is. What if this is something akin to the 5 Elders, where they have presumably been granted some demonic beastly transformations? First and foremost, the immediate use of an awakened form is very similar to how the Elders spawned immediately in their awakened forms, though I guess you could argue that Lucci and Kaku have also been seen using their awakened states since their reintroduction. It could also be said that it's curious that this ability is not explicitly stated as a devil fruit, instead only being introduced with the name Cerberus. This is somewhat reminiscent of how the Elders' abilities were not stated as devil fruits either, with the names of the creatures being the only thing listed. But as we know, Oda does like to slow roll us with the formal reveals of devil fruits, so maybe this is not anything to overthink. Plus, the way Oda introduces this creature is akin to one of the ways in which he introduces actual named characters with the stylized font, the other being the classic Oda boxes. That said, it still is quite unique how the sword does not fully turn into the Cerberus, but rather retains its form and stays connected to the tail. But what's a bit more damning is the widespread presence of black flames. In the last chapter, we wondered if Gunko's arrow abilities also had something more going on, perhaps even being granted to them by Imu, since we saw similar black flames beneath their feet. And here we've seen these flames cover the ground when Cerberus is being spawned, beneath its feet, and even emanating from the blades in its mouth. These dark flames also seem to trail out of its necks when the heads propel across the sky. Perhaps we are overthinking things here with the connections to Imu, but it wouldn't be a big surprise to anyone if all of these incredible fantastical powers have originated from them. We'll probably just have to see. Now, I mentioned that we might be able to use swords to pinpoint when Shanks may have returned to the Holy Land, and to do this, let's look at Shanks' named sword, Griffin. This sword is nearly identical to the sword owned by Shamrock. In fact, for quite a while, this was one of the things many people looked toward to theorize that the silhouetted figure here was related to Shanks in some way. With both of these swords being so similar in appearance, one begins to wonder if there are more commonalities between the two. With us learning that Shamrock's sword Cerberus has the ability to turn into an actual Cerberus, could it be the case that Shanks' Griffin can assume the form of a griffin? This would make quite an exciting parallel, as Cerberus was the Hound of Hades, while various accounts mention that griffins have been the Hounds of Zeus. While we've never seen Shanks use this kind of ability in the manga before, various animated adaptations have included the presence of some sort of griffin construct alongside Shanks. In the climax of Film Red, a griffin is shown manifesting from Shanks' slash alongside a lion's head appearing from Luffy's fist, with the two beings merging together to deal a finishing blow. But more interestingly, in the anime adaptation of Shanks defeating Eustace Kid, Shanks is shown spawning a large griffin before appearing in front of Kid. Up until this point, I had just taken these to be typical embellishments found in the anime to make things look cooler than they actually are. But now I'm starting to wonder if this is all some sort of foreshadowing of Shanks' true abilities that was told to the Toei staff by Oda. Now, in the case that there is some truth to this, and Shanks has a griffin-imbued blade akin to Shamrock's, the question is, when did he get it? Especially if it's a product of Imu's powers and not just a simple devil fruit. Well, one thing that many readers may not have realized is that Griffin is not Shanks' first sword, and actually, we've seen Shanks use multiple different blades across the series. Back during Shanks' meeting with Whitebeard, we got a flashback to him on Roger's ship, where he wields a plain sword that does not have any sort of knuckle bow around his fingers. Later on, during the Oden flashback, we would see a young Shanks once again with a different sword by his side, this time featuring the knuckle bow that sort of creates an S shape at the bottom of the sword's handle. This design is actually very similar to the sword that we saw with Shanks in Chapter 1, 12 years prior to the present day. In fact, the first time we would see the sword known as Griffin would be in Chapter 234, as Shanks prepared to meet with Whitebeard. Notice the difference between this sword and his sword from Chapter 1, as Griffin features a flat circular guard with the knuckle bow in the shape of a simple arc that is affixed to the end of the handle and the guard, whereas the other sword has the knuckle bow protruding from the bowl-shaped guard itself, forming an S shape at the end of the handle. From that brief flashback to Shanks' meeting with Ace, we can see that he had a sword more so resembling Griffin by that point, meaning he must have acquired it prior to 5 years ago. And by now you may be wondering if all of this could just be a simple error on Oda's part. After all, these were swords drawn years apart from each other, and he's been shown to make more egregious errors in less time. Ultimately, I do think it's possible that these were all meant to be the same blade. However, things get a bit more muddied when you take a look at Shanks' depiction in the second Decks of the World cover story, where he is portrayed with a sword that much more closely resembles the blade that he has in Chapter 1, as seen with the knuckle bow protruding out of the bowl-shaped guard. So, on one hand, while these all could just be errors from Oda spanning across the decades, it may also be plausible that Shanks has two different swords. With the blade being so close in appearance to Shamrock's Cerberus, one would wonder if it had the same origin. Could Shanks have received this sword as a birthright of his Figarland lineage when he returned to the Holy Land? If it is true that Shanks obtained griffins sometime between 12 and 5 years ago, then we have a 7-year window for that to have happened, which includes his victory over Loki 6 years ago and his rise to Emperor status. Of course, as a reminder, this is all still just some fun speculation going off of the few bits of info that we know at the moment. I'm sure that a lot of these ideas could change once we get more revelations. There's still a lot of mystery surrounding Shanks, now more so than ever, and I'm excited to see Oda finally get into it. Okay, we're pretty far into this breakdown and have not even scratched the surface of the big reveals at the end. I apologize for spending so much time on these first few pages, but I genuinely think there's a lot of interesting stuff surrounding them that I wanted to voice. But let's continue on. We learned in the previous chapter that the Holy Knight's motivation in recruiting Loki was to use his strength and influence against the rest of Elbaf in order to conquer the nation. However, with Loki refusing, they now intend on going to their secondary plan, using the children of Elbaf as leverage. As the two fly away on a bird created by Gunko's arrow fruit, Shamrock instructs her to call another person, presumably a third Holy Knight. Now, this sets the stage for a very interesting development, as we have 3 Holy Knights against the 3 original Straw Hats as a potential pair-off. Nami in particular has been shown to have a soft spot for children, so this idea of putting the giant children in harm's way is not going to sit well for her. This plan actually may tie back in with our theories in the previous weeks of Carmel and Harold wanting to pacify the nation of Elbaf over the generations. As Shamrock mentions, it would be way too hard to take down all of the warriors at once, but if they are able to attack their weakest links, then the rest may fall before them. Instilling these values of pacifism and kindness to the newer generations make them easy targets for this plan that we see unfolding now. Over at Arost Castle, the OG trio finds the guards that were attacked by the Holy Knights, and the giants seem to believe that it was Shanks who attacked them. While Nami and Zoro entertain the possibility of such a thing, Luffy adamantly detests and suggests that it must be someone that just looked like him. This probably means we won't be getting a scene where Luffy is fooled into thinking Shamrock's is Shanks or any sort of confusion like that. And interestingly, Luffy brings up Bellmare and says Nami would be angry too if someone said bad things about her. While Luffy chose not to listen to Nami's backstory as told by Nojiko, we can assume that he eventually learned about her at a later point in time, much like how the crew learned of Saul's significance to Robin just before this arc. The group wonders if Shanks could have a brother, which is great since it means it's less likely for this artificial dramatic irony to come into play once again, and this prompts Luffy to think about what he knows about Shanks' family. Apparently, he was aware that Shanks grew up on a pirate ship and figures that he was raised by Roger and Rayleigh. This text is overlaid on the image of the mysterious man in the casa making his way toward the castle. Up until this point, he was only shown in silhouette, but now we finally see some details, and if you'll recall, his appearance from the back looks to be identical with the man Crocus was sharing a drink with in the Decks of the World cover story. For a long time, fans have speculated that this may be Shiki, given the long hair and striped cloak, but some have wondered if this could be Skopper Gaban, the third member of the prominent trio that we saw in the Roger Pirates. Now, throughout this arc, I've gone at length about all the potential hints for this to be Shiki, just given his general silhouette and the presence of the strong-world animal designs in the underworld. However, given the rising importance of Shanks' origin in this arc and the framing of this character in this chapter, I feel like it's now even more likely to be Gaban. After all, Gaban was alongside Roger and Rayleigh when they found Shanks, and with this chapter featuring Luffy calling out the major Roger pirates who would have been close to Shanks between Roger, Rayleigh, and Buggy, this person being someone on the crew that Luffy has no knowledge of makes a lot of sense. The general shape and length of the hair aligns very well here, and while he had dark hair in his younger days, it's likely that it just turned white with age. As cool as it would have been for this to be Shiki, I think Skopper is the most likely candidate at this moment. Though, I will say, there is one Roger pirate who has yet to be portrayed in the manga proper, only having been shown in the sketches of the Roger pirates provided by Oda in Volume 96's SBS, a man named Yamon. While I don't know how likely it is for him to take the stage here, I should note him as an interesting possibility, especially given how he has somewhat similar spiked hair. Back over near the southwest of the Western Village, we check in with Frankie, who seems to be accompanied by Ripley on a tour of the Jewel Tree Atom. He mentions how funny it is that the rare material isn't so scarce after all, but realizes that its price likely comes from the difficulty that would come with acquiring it from a giant stronghold. Recall that Frankie was able to buy enough of this material to build 1,000 Sunny for 200 million berry. The two approach a curious drawing on the wall, which bewilders Frankie even at a distance, as Ripley explains that these are likely the work of children from the Void Century. Now, we'll go into details about this mural in just a second, but it's important to note that Ripley believes that these depictions of all these various races coming together for a united cause, as opposed to warring with each other, may be nothing more than a child's dream. This is incredibly striking as it brings to mind the shared dream of both Roger and Luffy. We first got a hint of this during the Shamondi Archipelago arc when Rayleigh recalled the time when Shanks visited him and mentioned that there was a child in the East Blue that had said the same exact thing Roger had said. Then, during the Aesop Luffy flashback, we got the scene in which Luffy proclaimed his dream to the two brothers, but at the time, it was framed in a way such that it would lead us to think that he was simply talking about becoming the king of the pirates. However, something was always off about this because we had seen Luffy making that statement before, so cutting away from what he actually said suggested that there was more going on. The scene of Ace being bewildered and Sabo laughing would eventually be mirrored during the Oden flashback when Roger also revealed his dream to two others. Oden was in shock, while Whitebeard laughed and dismissed it as something a little kid would think of. And of course, more recently, we saw Luffy disclose his dream to the rest of the Straw Hats at the start of the Egghead arc, which was met with a wide array of mixed reactions from the crew. The straightforward read here would be that Roger and Luffy both dream of what the mural depicts, a unification of the races and peoples of the world, and while I do think that is a big part of it, I have to hope that there's a bit more than just that. A fun twist that wouldn't be so easily predicted by fans like we have over the course of the story, and one that wouldn't be laid out so clearly in front of us like this. Now over at the Owl Library, Saul brings out the Harley, the collection of Elbath myths and legends that we learned of just a few chapters ago. Notice that the cover of the book features the recurring sun symbol with the 8 surrounding circles that we've seen across the series, though it's a bit hard to tell what exactly is supposed to be at the center in this instance. Saul reiterates how there are various interpretations of it and what Nika means to people. Saul reiterates how there are various interpretations of both it and what Nika means to people, and confirms what we once suspected with the stories of Nika and the worship of the sun god being spread across many cultures. He explains that the one thing all of these people share is Nika's propensity to laugh and dance to the rhythm that we've come to know as the drums of liberation. We saw this most recently with the Buccaneer myths about Nika that were bestowed upon Bonnie by Kuma. Over in the Western Village, we can see Stanson and Hyruden taking part in the dance as well, with the Arl, Gerd, and Brogy all enjoying themselves. Brook and what looks to be Usopp seem to be enjoying the celebrations as well. I would like to take a quick second to point out how Oda has been showing Brogy off quite a bit recently, giving him some more screen time than Dory. We last saw the two together in 1135 when they toasted with the Straw Hats, but I've not seen Dory since. Now, of course, the biggest part of this chapter is none other than the double page spread at the end. Oda does not do full double pages much at all anymore, with the last one having been the arrival of the 5 elders on Egghead, and the last one before that being a nearly decade prior. So when he pulls these out, you know that it's going to be meaningful. First and foremost, before diving too deep here, it should be noted that the entire point of this Harley text is that different people who read it have different interpretations of what it means. As such, I don't believe anyone in particular has all of the answers, and to some degree, I'm not necessarily dying to know what this all means exactly, because I'm fairly confident all of this will make sense to us eventually at some point. That said, if you have some observation or interpretation that you'd like to share, I'd love to read about it in the comments. Alright. So the passage about the first world talks about a flame that existed on or within the planet. Humanity was tempted by it and touched the forbidden sun. This is very evocative of the Mother Flame, which was Vegapunk's approximation of this undying energy source that existed in the distant past. Lilith even compared their creation with the likes of the sun itself, as it is being done here. And this metaphor of the humans touching a forbidden sun was also evoked by Vegapunk during his broadcast in the chapter titled The Wings of Icarus. Within the context of the mural, we may be able to point to these spiked clusters as representations of the Mother Flame. You can see a number of people bringing this resource out of the depths of the earth itself and placing them near various constructs and structures to presumably power them. This energy allowed for the creation of an advanced civilization, as shown to the right, with these complex gears and tall buildings with pluming smoke. And you'll also notice a bevy of ships in this section that curiously do not have any sails, nor for the most part oars. This is in stark contrast to the ships that we'd see depicted under the Third World after the world has been flooded. Now to me, this suggests that all of these vehicles are being powered by this energy source itself, allowing them to maneuver without the need for an external force. The one ship that is the exception, however, is the one that's clearly high in the air near the moon. Its design is nearly evocative of the Ark Maxim, the flying ship that was constructed under Endel's orders, with these giant oars on the side and these propeller-like structures up top. It's not clear to me if this is descending downwards or flying upwards, but I have to wonder if this is supposed to be a nod to the origin of the Sky People, which was first disclosed to us in Endel's cover story in a very similar manner with these wall paintings. In it, the 3 tribes of sky races left their city on the moon, known as Burka, in order to acquire resources from the blue planet on which our story takes place. Of note, in that cover story, Enel finds the existence of space pirates who were also drilling deep down into the moon in search of something, which just goes to show how this quest for resources is ongoing throughout the ages. Now, this arc can be seen sending down a bolt of lightning toward the Earth, more specifically the tree in the center. Recall that the Birkin ruins and technology on the moon were able to be powered by Enel's Devil Fruit abilities, suggesting that the people of the moon used electricity as their energy source, but may have eventually run out. If this large circle above the Arc Maxim analog is to be understood as the moon, then we may even be able to interpret the other clusters of circles above it as planets, or perhaps other moons. We don't have the best understanding of the world of One Piece's place in the cosmos at large, but the scholars of Ohara had created a working model for their system. From their perspective, the Earth seemed to be at the center, suggesting that these could be various moons, but I think it's more likely that they simply had a geocentric perspective of the universe, and instead, these other satellites are more likely planets in their own right. Now, this bolt of lightning strikes near a very curious and ambiguous structure, this gray mass that surrounds another autonomous ship, one that is very reminiscent of the Noah, the Ship of Promise. We first saw this giant arc in the Fishman Island arc, where it was believed to be necessary for the inhabitants of the island to eventually make their way to the surface world. It was said that the Noah was constructed by the people of Fishman Island in the past, which suggests to me that this may not be the same ship, but rather an analog. And interestingly, we don't see any fishmen in this first section at all. We're actually quite hard pressed to find any races that aren't humans, aside from the one figure here with wings. This could be a nod to the migration of the Sky People from the moon, but it's still not clear. There are also a few animals below the Noah-like ship, which evokes the namesake story from the Bible, where Noah was instructed to build an ark and bring aboard 2 of every species in order to survive a great flood, and we'll revisit that in just a second. Some have likened this gray structure surrounding the Noah to Zunatia, with this elephant-like trunk at the forefront. I don't know if this is where Oda is going with this, but with the striking lack of other races in this early world and the proximity of these animals and humans within it, I sort of wonder if this is supposed to be a nod to the origin of the mink tribe. The minks do seem to consider humans as a subspecies of them, so there may be some evolutionary connection back in the distant past. Though ultimately, this gray mass may just be some sort of ship, given the orbs at the front beneath the crowned individual who is also shaded darker than the rest of the humans. This may be the ruler of humanity at the time, perhaps even Emu themselves. Now, these individuals holding the clusters of energy were likely the slaves that are mentioned in the Harley. It's hard to tell what exactly this means, but the folks on the other side of the elevator-like device appear with halos on their head. Some may think of this as sainthood being achieved, but I wonder if this is the side of the elevator that is actually descending into the earth, with the bottommost figure being amidst the metaphorical flames of hell and no longer having his pure halo above him. This could be a representation of how this desire for acquiring the ancient energy source turned man evil in the eyes of the holy, or something to that effect. Now, these slaves would end up praying and bringing forth the first sun god. Where exactly he's depicted in this section is not clear, but in response, the god of the earth used its hellfire serpent and seemingly punished the world for its acts against him, whatever that may mean as well. The gods that are referenced in the Harley are very reminiscent of the gods that we first saw mentioned by the Shandians in Nolan's flashback. While there are a few linguistic differences among them, it is cool to see these old ideas get brought back into the fold for a larger mythology. The punishment by the Earth God is a bit vague, but many have linked this Hellfire Serpent to this blood-soaked serpent line from Dorian Brogy back during the Little Garden arc. For years, fans have speculated that this serpent was a metaphor for the Red Line, which is a seemingly indestructible structure that spans the world. I'm not entirely sure on this connection to the Harley, but I figured it's worth mentioning. Now, the second world picks up from the void that was left at the end of the first one with the sudden existence of breath. This line is pretty ambiguous, but I suppose it could mean life as they knew it began anew. We have this notion of the forest god, once again mentioned before in the Nolan flashback, who has seemingly tamed or let loose demons or devils depending on the translation. To me, this reads as a potential origin story for the creation of devil fruits, with the sun spreading the fires of war, suggesting that the original energy source was used to help with these technological advancements in combat and the creation of the fruits. The buds or leaves we see on this tree could in fact be individual devil fruits themselves. People of the Half Moon are mentioned here, with the latter likely being in reference to the Sky People we previously discussed, but the people of the Half Moon sounds to me like the people of the D. The mention of the Half Moon is reminiscent of the title of chapter 292, To Meet Like the Half Moon Hidden by Clouds, and this was the chapter where Noland was executed for his alleged lies of a city of gold, and Kalgara and the Shandians were shot up to the sky by the Nagab stream. The idea of these people dreaming once again ties back into the idea of devil fruits being born or made, with the notion expressed in the previous arc by Vegapunk that the devil fruits were born out of humanity's desire to do certain things. This passage is followed by the idea of humanity killing the sun, or in this case, using up all of this energy source, and the sea god bringing storm and flooding the world. This plays into the whole idea of the devil fruits being naturally rejected by the ocean and the sea god, which some have speculated to actually be Emu, drowning the world in order to weaken these people who have ascended to godhood by means of the devil fruits, though this could also just be in reference to the celestial dragons. The third world picks up after the void left by the end of the second one, what we may understand to be as the Void Century. The inconvenient remnants refers to the lasting members of the D clan who recall the promised day and hear the voice of the Half Moon, who would again be the bearers of the D from the past. The promised day is something we've heard throughout the series, and Noah was said to be the ship of promise. Now the rest of this passage describes the return of the sun god and how he will bring the world to its end toward a new morning, which is likely where a lot of the confusion among the Elbaf giants stems from. While I've been leaving it out this whole time, each of the prior passages have ended with these two undisclosed parties never meeting, but this time they do. When you think of long-awaited meetings in the series, the first thing you might think of is the meeting of the two sovereigns as mentioned by the Sea Kings at the end of the Fishman Island arc, but here, in this context, I'm wondering if this is in reference to the incarnation of the sun god and this big bad that we've seen throughout these various sections. While it's possible these creatures, the serpent, the dragon, and the demon, are all separate beings, what if they're meant to portray the same person or creature? And what if this is Emu himself over the years, having taken different forms? In each of these prior worlds, while we know the sun god is meant to have been around somewhere according to Elbaf legend, he's not depicted in the first two, and not until the third world, where he comes face to face with this giant creature. Of note, each of these shaded beasts are also seen surrounded by the energy source in some way, which may be a hint toward their connection. Also, the dragon and the serpent can be interpreted as fighting one another, or in a more abstract sense, one could view this as them sharing the same flame or breath, as them being one and the same. Anyways, there are a lot of quote-unquote cameos in this section, so let's go through all of the different people that will come together to fight off Emu's forces. From the top, we have some humans riding whales. These may be fishmen, it's not completely clear, but we should note that whales have been fairly prevalent throughout the series, from Laboon to Whitebeard's ship, the Moby Dick. During Oden's flashback, we also learn that the whales awaited the meeting of the two sovereigns, so maybe this is in regards to that. In front of them is a winged individual with what looks to be a flame above them or behind them, likely a Lunarian, and behind the whale may be a mink in Sulong form, though we see what looks to be a normal mink later on, so it's not clear. One of these could be a race that we have yet to encounter. Beneath them is of course Emmet, the giant robot met in the last arc, and to his left is the incarnation of Nika, the sun god, wielding a sword and shield. The shield features the symbol of the sun that we've seen throughout the story in many forms, boasted by various cultures. It's recognizable by the circle in the middle, surrounded by 8 smaller circles, and beneath him is what looks to be an ancient giant, one that in particular looks a lot like Loki. I wonder if this giant weapon in its hand could be a nod to the large sword that's stuck in Elbaf. Behind him is a ship bearing the same symbol. This may be the nation of Alabasta, as evidenced by the woman with long hair in the front, and the nation having a similar flag in present day. Beneath that ship are of course the people of Wano, samurais with top knots and ninjas with shurikens, but beneath them is a bit harder to make out, as this could be a long-armed tribesman with the person underneath them being a long-legged tribesman, given how you can see more of their legs. In front of them are some groups that are a bit hard to make out, but above them is a fish, perhaps representing all of the various sea beasts around the world, or maybe even the Goldfish Empire in particular. Above that is of course the representative of the fishmen with the mermaid princess, and behind her is a Tontada. In front of the aforementioned mink looks to be a regular-sized giant leading the charge. Going against them on the demon side are what I can only imagine as the forces of the world government, given their outfits and head coverings that are reminiscent of medieval knights. I would venture to say that these may be the holy knights themselves. That's a lot of information to process and a bit too much speculation than I normally like to do in one video, so to briefly recap these 3 passages, the first world seems to be about the discovery of this ancient energy source by man deep within the earth, the enslavement of each other to acquire it, and the slaves bringing forth a savior known as the sun god, and how the god of the earth punished humanity for this. The second world looks to be a telling of the origin story of the devil fruits by the product of man's desire for change and the use of this energy source. With their creation, the energy source was depleted and the god of the sea punished humanity once again. And the last world speaks of a fateful meeting between the sun god and his undisclosed enemy, which may be one and the same with the various other gods that were mentioned throughout these passages, where the sun god will bring the world to its end and start anew. My last bit of speculation before leaving off here is that I imagine there is something of great importance just in front of where Frankie is standing. Using Frankie as the one in the crew to witness all of this is quite interesting, as there is a long-running theory that he has memorized the blueprints of the Pluton and has been reconstructing it himself. We'll have to see if that goes anywhere. Again, this is all just my interpretation, and I'm sure there's a lot more smaller things in here that will gain new significance as we get more and more from the story. Like, for example, why does the ancient giant, the serpent, and that one planet all share a similar arrow pattern across their design? Or perhaps these giant beasts and ships all correspond with the ancient weapons. But there's only so much I can do in this one video, and I feel like I've already rambled enough as it is. If you've made it this far, I appreciate you for watching all this time. Stay safe, and I hope to see you in the next one.